Hello, everyone. My name is Dr. Christine Veres, and it's my honor today to introduce to you our guest speaker, Professor Guido Devadder. He's an experimental animator from Belgium, and he works at the animation department at Lucas School of Arts in Brussels. And he currently teaches image research and drawing, and he's working on a practice-based PhD titled From Post-Cinema to Pre-Cinema and Back, Media Archaeology of Loop Animation. It is our pleasure to have Professor Devadder here with us today to talk about his work. He's going to do an introduction of his school and of his current practice as well. Please join me in welcoming Professor Devadder. Thank you.
And thank you, Dr. Veres, for introducing me so nicely. It's always a great honor, but also a big pleasure to share your enthusiasm with like-minded students. So before, oh, wait a minute. Before going into my research and my artistic practice, I want to say a little word about where I work, where I teach. This is Lucas School of Arts in Belgium, in the northern part of Belgium, so the Dutch-speaking part. Lucas is a fairly young art academy. It consists of 5 different campuses all over Flanders. And the campus where I work is Sint Lucas in Brussels. Lucas School of Arts is actually the art faculty of KU Leuven, which is the main university, the biggest university in Belgium. As I'm an inhabitant of Leuven, this is my hometown. Just a bit of information about Leuven. So what you can see on the left is the hall of the Central University Library, which is a very big place. I can see the tower of the building from the room where I'm sitting now. And on the right, you can see the city center. So that's the town hall and the St. Pieterskerk, both from the 15th century. Leuven, by the way, was elected as one of the 5 most beautiful cities to visit in 2022. So whenever you're around, always welcome. Campus Sint Lucas Brussel was founded in 1880. So the pictures you see on the left are probably from the 1920s or 30s. And what you can see on the right is how the campus looks right now, or at least the older side of the campus, because we had a very thorough renovation some 15 years ago. So most of the campus is all new. The picture on the right is where the animation department is situated. So in the middle floor where the terrace is, that's where our animation department starts. So as you can see, it's quite close to the center of Brussels. We're an art academy. We offer master's degrees in fine arts, in photography, also in graphic storytelling and illustration, and media and information design. And of course, there's audiovisual arts with film and animation. And the best way to describe the philosophy is really like an animation department embedded in an art school. Our philosophy is to put the focus on the artistic part and the authorship. We're known for quite unconventional films, animation films, but also projects which belong to the field of expanded animation, so which go beyond the cinematic screen. This is also reflected in my colleagues' work. So there's, for instance, Emma de Swaaf, who is part of the Mark and Emma collective. There's Eve Bex, who makes very poetic movies. There is Soetkin Verstegen, whose last film was a stop-motion film using ice models. There is Geert van den Broele, who specializes in hand-drawn animation, always very surrealistic. There's Imge and Sina Osbilge, two sisters who work together as a team. They also do hand-drawn animation, but also digital animation. And their work is shown both in cinemas and in art galleries. Same goes for Alexandra Krauwers, who mainly makes installations, digital installations. So I teach drawing. I also teach some more technical modules, but my main focus is the image research lab. So it's a bit different than most animation courses. So most animation courses are project-based. What we do in the image research lab is more process-based. So the methodology is more experimental, which means there is no predefined output, but students are encouraged to experiment and to explore, and they define their output as they go along that path. One of the things we specialize in is media archaeology. So especially in the second year, so it's a 2-year course. In the second year, the focus is on media archaeology of combining old and new media. So there we deconstruct the animation process and the cinematic apparatus. We look at things like lenses, projection, movement, and sometimes we even take apart damaged equipment to recombine things. So the central question in the image research lab is not only what is animation, but especially what can animation be. So we go beyond the typical cinema screen and we look for different kinds of output. So what we, for instance, do is using 35mm slides. I'm not sure, has anyone already worked with 35mm slides? Just talk in your microphone.
Or you can put in the chat. I have.
Yeah. So 35mm slides are of course, especially for photographic means, but we also do unintended use. So, okay, because you're old, yeah, so am I. So, so what we also do is draw on 35mm slides, etching, work with collage. We work with different kinds of projectors, with overhead projectors, so which you might know from the liquid light shows, the psychedelic light shows from the 1960s. We work with 8mm, 16mm projections. And all the equipment we have in the lab is for you. So it's not a museum. Everything we have, we also use. One of the central pieces in our lab is the Steenbeck 16mm table. I suppose Steenbeck is not well known in the United States. It's originally a German company. They're now situated in Venray in the Netherlands. And a Steenbeck table is very tolerant to what it accepts as film. So the image you see here is actually collage on 16mm film, which is possible because at the heart of the Steenbeck there is a polygonal prism. So it's actually the same as a Praxinoscope, which we'll encounter later on. Of course, we also work a lot with proto-cinematic devices. So on the left, you can see a whole bunch of Arnoctoscopes, laser cuts for a workshop. So afterwards, they were painted with Blackboard paint, and then students can easily test out their animations using ordinary chalk. And on the right is also a laser cut zoetrope, and it's always very interesting to use laser cutting or 3D printing for prototyping these devices. It generates a lot of knowledge, hands-on knowledge on how this 19th century equipment functions. But we never do the old because of the old. We always look for ways to redefine animation, looking for new applications. So what you can see here is student work. On the left is work from Koen Malit, who made a combination between a zoetrope and it's hooked up to a computer, and then the output is a sort of generated generative art using processing. On the right is work by Elim Wouters, who researches ways in which animation can be placed in a spatial sequence. So media archaeology is a term which has already which we've already encountered. So media archaeology is not really a very rigid theory, but what they have in common, most media archaeologists, is that they have a nonlinear or non-teleological view on media history. Which means that there is a lot of interest in obsolete technology, in dead ends. One of the theorists, Erkki Huhtamo, introduced the notion of topoi, of elements in media history that recur in a cyclic way. For instance, how VR now relates to anaglyph 3D movies from the 1950s, and further back even to the stereoscopy craze in the 19th century. So from this perspective, media that came to a dead end in its time of invention might offer new and exciting possibilities for the current situation. So in the same spirit, imaginary media, compare this to visionary architecture, gained a lot of attention. And science fiction, of course, is a great source of inspiration for imaginary media. Myself, I'm much fascinated by the holodeck in Star Trek, also from a philosophical angle. It's very interesting. So it's not a big surprise that a science fiction novelist, Bruce Sterling, I don't know if the name rings a bell. So Bruce Sterling is originally from Texas, and he originated the Dead Media Project. Now, the Dead Media Project, it seems to have died, so it's a sort of meta death, but the nodes of the project are still online. So it's a great source for inspiration if you want to look at strange contraptions from the past, then this link will give you a lot of information, a lot of inspiration. So a lot of theorists here, but I want to single out one quote for today from Siegfried Zielinski in Deep Time of the Media, book from 2006. He writes in the introduction, if we deliberately alter the emphasis, turn it around, and experiment, the result is worthwhile. Do not seek the old in the new, but find something new in the old. So this way, working with obsolete media also becomes a practice-based methodology. Central to that is also the notion of thinkering from Erkki Huhtamo, which is a combination of thinking and tinkering. I personally like the metaphor of a patch panel. So, a patch panel for analog audio or analog video, where you connect the past and the present, both on a conceptual and a theoretical and a technological level. Old versus new media is something I used to struggle with for a long time and still do. For instance, to make a little confession, I hate drawing on a Wacom board. I absolutely cannot draw on a board which is plastic on plastic. And I miss the happy little accidents, to quote Bob Ross, which you can only encounter if you work with, as I like to do, with pen and ink or ink wash, where the results are always different than what you expect. And there is no undo button. So everything that you do has to be right, and it gives you a very different concentration when working. The image on the left then is one of my more vibrant childhood memories when I was a kid, when I was 9 years old, which was a long time ago in 1984. My older brother studied computer sciences, and so we had a Commodore 64 computer in our house. And soon I started programming, so I had a book to learn new programming. And I combined different short scripts. One, for instance, was to generate random colors. And then the other script was to make a picture in a picture. So what I did then was make a picture in a picture in a picture in a picture, and they were all flashing random colors. It drove my parents crazy. It was actually very modern, the Commodore 64. The way it worked was a bit like processing. So my first animations actually were code-based, were generative arts. So it's unfortunately that NFTs didn't exist yet at that time. But when I was a youngster in Belgium, of course, I also loved comic books. We're the home country of Tintin and Snowy. And when I started studying literature, I wanted to do something with comics. And as my master's thesis, I've worked on American comics, on underground comics with Robert Crumb. I don't know if Robert Crumb still rings a bell. And there's another living legend from also from Texas. Um, Anyone knows who I'm talking about? So one of the great living legends from underground comics is Gilbert Shelton. He lives in France for a long time, but is originally, I think, from Austin, or he studied at Austin. I think he's originally from Houston. And so afterwards, I went studying at St. Lucas, where there was a graphic storytelling department, graphic storytelling and multimedia. And together with some classmates at the end of our studies, we started a comics anthology called Ink, which ran quarterly for 4 years. But of course, drawing alternative comics in a small country, so everything was published in Dutch, is not something you can make a living out. So I had the good fortune of being able to work good with computers. So I was good with digital editing and post-production. And I could go start working at St. Lucas. So here's more recent. I still like to do a lot of drawing and graphic storytelling. Here's a more recent project. But when I was working in St. Lucas as the computer whiz kid, I found my main vocation in the storage rooms with all the old equipment. And I soon started making direct animation films, which means that you directly paint or draw on 16mm film or 35mm film. But as you know, it's a very tiny format. So if you work on 16mm film, then your frame is just 1 centimeter wide on 7mm high. So it's not really suited for making representational drawings. So I was looking for hybrids, and I found it using the film strip format by Adobe. So this allowed me to work on a larger format and then scan the film strips into my computer and immediately transfer them to a moving image using Premiere or After Effects. So this from the project Dependa, which I finished in 2011. It was a multi-screen installation. Here's an installation view which ran on Cinema Voltaire, a media art festival in Brussels. And I'll maybe show a very short fragment. Didn't run very smoothly, I suppose, but I've included the link, so if you want to go see it again, it's something you can see online. But if you go looking for the film strip format when this talk is finished, unfortunately, it has gone from the Adobe programs. So it was originally intended actually for compositing. And I've even wrote mails to Adobe to ask them to reintroduce it, but they haven't even answered. But it's a unique way of dealing with animation, because when you work with a film strip, then everything you do as spatial data. So if you draw a vertical line on a film strip and then you play it back, then it transforms into something temporal. What you can see here is not a digital film strip. This is actually a purely analog film strip, sort of a meditational project. Drawn on 16, not on 16 millimeter film, but on 8 millimeter film. So there you have an even more tiny surface. It's about 5.8 by 4 millimeters, something like this per frame. And I drew on both sides of the film. So if you have analog film, this one was from an old cartridge which was never developed. But if you have old film and you want to make it transparent, you can submerge it in bleach, and then all the emulsion will fade away, and you will have, or you wind up with transparent film you can draw or paint on. So so this is really a meditational project. It's called Figure 8. So if you have the film horizontally and you draw the figure 8 and you play it back, your film is vertically, then it becomes an infinity symbol. So it's a whole cartridge of 8 millimeter film, contains about 3,500 frames. So painted on both sides means that I drew about 7,000 times the figure 8, which comes pretty close to infinity. And it is absolutely a fun activity. So the surface is so small that the result always looks different than what you would think it looked like. So here's also the link. I won't be showing this film, but it's on Vimeo also. It's not really meant to be shown as a film. This is more meant to be shown as an installation. We'll also see later on that working with loops is something which requires a different kind of dispositif, different kind of stance towards film than narrative cinema. But then after a while, I discovered pre-cinematic animations, and this also has a very unique spatiotemporal entanglement. So the frames are being segmented, or time is being sliced up by means of a shutter, but at the same time, all the images are simultaneously present. So at the same time, your time becomes unframed, and you have a very different approach to making moving images than you have with any other way of digital or analog filmmaking. The doors of perception, so to speak, were opened originally by the physicist Michael Faraday, who observed that when two cogwheels were rotating at the same speed but in opposite directions, they had the appearance of standing still. So, which was, of course, an eccentricity of human perception, but which could also be potentially very dangerous for factory workers who could lose their fingers. Faraday published about his observation, and this was picked up by my compatriot Joseph Plateau, and also by the Austrian mathematician and inventor Simon von Stampfer. So the biography of Joseph Plateau is very indicative to the relation between art and science. So a little question, how hard was it for you guys to try and convince your parents to choosing an artistic career? Would it be a great idea according to your parents?
Anyone would like to share?
I think for me, it was harder to convince myself than it was to convince my parents.
Okay.
Just I grew up in a world where everything was like trying to get all business. You got to go to college and get a high-paying job and outclass the generation behind you. And I'm just like, I just enjoy making things, but I didn't feel like it was a valid option for the longest time, even though my parents were willing to support me.
Yeah, for Joseph Plateau, things were a bit different. So his father was a famous artist, and he wanted his son to step into his footsteps. But the young Joseph was more interested in science. So he went to obey his father, and he went to art school. But then after his father died, he stopped going to art school, and he started studying science. One of the things he was studying most was the human eye and how perception worked. So before inventing the phenakistoscope, he had already invented another device, which is called the Arnoctoscope, which dealt with anamorphic distortions. But Plateau read Faraday's article, and he started researching this phenomenon. And later on, he declared that he was only interested in the scientific consequences of it, but as he had an artistic training, he drew some figures, rotating ballet dancer to illustrate it, mainly to make ordinary people without a scientific background understand the phenomenon he was studying. He created a series of discs, which became a big immediate success. But to his immense surprise, he found that copies of his inventions circulated only just after he brought them to the market. And this was, of course, the work of Simon von Stamfer from Austria, who invented exactly the same disc just 1 month after Plateau invented it. So the only difference between the disc from Plateau and Stamfer is that Stamfer used round peeping holes, while Joseph Plateau used vertical slits. So as I'm concerned, Plateau and Stamfer, they're equally important in inventing the phenakistoscope, or as Stamfer called them, stroboscopische Scheiben. The word phenakistoscope, by the way, it's Greek for deceiving perception. So phenax means to deceive, and scopen means to see. This name only appeared later, so Plateau would first call it the phantascope. And I also think there is, in the United States, it's more common to call it phenakistoscope. So I'm following the way it's mostly spelled in Europe, which is phenakistoscope. Just one letter difference. The wheel of Faraday worked with two discs rotating in an opposite direction. Here you see on the left how most phenakistoscopes work. So you peer through the slits and then look into a mirror, which was also something which Faraday has already discovered. Later on, there were types of phenakistoscopes with a separate shutter disc. So where you had two discs. And what happened by looking through the slits is that it gets the function of a shutter. So if you look to the rotating disc without looking through the slits, then all the images would merge together in motion blur. So it's only when you look through the slits that you can see this as an animation. And that's really at the heart of every film projector or every camera. So the picture on the bottom right is how most film cameras work, or how the shutter looks with most film cameras, which means it's a 180-degree shutter. You still find the terminology if you go into After Effects. So as you might know, After Effects has built-in motion blur. And if you go into the advanced options in After Effects, you can adjust the motion blur by adjusting the shutter angle. So default is 180 degrees, but as it's digital, you can even go to 720 degrees as your shutter angle. So which means actually that you have quite a long shutter speed with film. And it's also, so if you're working with a digital camera and you want to make it look like film, the best tip is take for your shutter speed, take 1 divided by the double of your frame rate. So for instance, if you shoot at 25 frames per second, then if you choose 150, that's your shutter speed, you have quite a lot of motion blur. This looks the most natural to the eye, and it looks the most cinematic. So people always focus on depth of field, but actually motion blur is one of the things which makes you experience moving image as cinematic. Of course, the shutter is also integrated into a traditional film camera, and then the central image you see is how these projectors would function a long time ago, which means there's a two-bladed shutter. So every time the film moves, the shutter is before the gate, and when the image stands still, the image is being projected. So why does a more modern film projector has 3 blades? That's because of the flicker fusion. So flicker fusion happens above 50 hertz, so 50 on and off variations per second. And exactly, so the persistence of vision theory is something which has long been thought of as the way we perceive moving images as moving images. And in film theory, it's surprising that a lot of theorists, even Thomas Elsasser, he deliberately speaks about persistence of vision as the general principle behind perceiving moving images. But I've discussed this with one of the leading theorists on perception of Kai Leuven, and he is more, or he thinks that the theory of Wertheimer with the phi phenomenon and then the flicker fusion is much closer to the truth. But of course, science hasn't figured it out exactly, and that's of course where there's room for artistic research. So there's a big difference between how a phenakistoscope would look as a physical object, as the 19th century object, or as a digitized object. And it was when seeing these digitized versions, which convinced me to start experimenting with the medium myself. A very important catalyst for this was the collection of Richard Balzer, a collector who had a whole lot of optical toys. You can visit his website. It's also a great resource for inspiration. And somewhere in, I think 2008, he hired a young animator to digitize his phenakistoscope disc, not as a still image, but as a moving image. And it's one of the fascinating wormholes in media theory or media history also, because the way a phenakistoscope works and the way a GIF image works is very similar. There is no sound, so both are silent. Both favor seamless loops and very short animation. So these were an instant internet success after they were digitized. And it's a bit like a sort of time machine almost. It's like hatching a dinosaur egg and then starting an amusement park with real life dinosaurs. But it also opens a lot of new possibilities. So contrary to the analog physical phenakistoscope discs, you can have a lot more detail in a digital image. So when looking through the slits, you needed an image without too much detail and with a lot of contrast to make the animation stand out. But in a digital context, you can add a lot more detail, a lot more refinement. And so this way you can we'll see some examples of this later on, but you can make it into a new medium. Unfortunately, a lot of these old phenakistoscopes were digitized not exactly correctly. So normally these two are correctly, but if you go into the Tumblr page of Richard Balzer, you also see a lot of phenakistoscopes where the slits aren't stationary, but they're also rotating. So here's a little tutorial on how to do it correctly. And also, if you want to make your own phenakistoscope discs, which parameters you have to take into account to make it work as it should. So if you go into After Effects and you make a new composition, the first thing you have to take into account is the number of segments, the number of frames you're going to use. So if you want to draw out a phenakistoscope by yourself, it's very easy to make a template in Adobe Illustrator. So in Illustrator, there is a circular grid, I think it's called, which you can divide into wedge-shaped segments. So the number of segments defines how much frames are in your animation. Best take a quite low frame rate. So I usually take 12. And then your duration becomes 10 frames, which is the last two numbers in the timecode. If you would take, for instance, 16 frames, you can just dial down 16. So After Effects makes it into 1 second and 4 frames. Also very important is to keep your anchor point exactly at the center of your disk. Otherwise, it gets very wobbly. Also, which you can see here. So the left one is a bit wobbly. So if you put your anchor point at right in the center, then it will be stable. Then the formula for rotating is you want actually the one to last segment to be at the position right before it gets back to make a full circle. So the first thing you need to know is how or what is the angle of one segment, which is very easy to calculate. You have 360 degrees in a circle and you divide it by the number of slits. So in this example, you take 10 slits, so you have 36 degrees per segment. And then for the last frame, your rotation parameter will be 360 minus the angle of a segment. If your animation, so if you do a hand-drawn phenakistoscope and usually when you're right-handed, you'd make your animation go clockwise, then you have to dial in a negative rotation number. So it would become minus 324. So when you play this back, your template disk would look perfectly stationary. Nothing moves at all. So here is an example I just made in After Effects. So using the shape layers. And what I've did here is 3 layers, and I've parented all 3 layers to a null object layer. So the null object layer controls the rotation. And then the 3 separate layers contain different kinds of animation. So the magenta layer, the star is just a star getting bigger and smaller. So I just used a repeater for this. So with a little wiggle transform so that it goes smaller and bigger. And then if you add fewer segments, then you have, or fewer drawings, then you have segments, then they'll appear to go in the opposite direction of your rotation. If you add more drawings than you have segments, they will go in the same direction, so they spin around. Of course, it works great as an animated GIF file. In After Effects, in Media Encoder, you can make an animated GIF file, but it's quite limited, especially in terms of the frame rates you can choose. So best is to go to Photoshop for this. So in Photoshop, you can you have a lot of separate controls to define how your animated GIF is gonna work out. So you can, of course, define the number of pixels. You can set the looping options. And if your file gets too big, you can choose on the number of colors. So you can reduce the number of colors and your file will be smaller. The only thing which was a bit of a hiccup for me is in the so I'm now on an M1 MacBook Pro, and this is something which is not possible in Photoshop. You cannot import a video file in Photoshop, but I did it on another computer. So best then is from After Effects to export an intermediate project or intermediate files such as ProRes, for instance. There you can choose any possible frame rate and then import it into the timeline window in Photoshop and then make an animated GIF out of it. So this is then the result of my little digital test. But it's a very fun way to start animating if you do this just intuitively. If you make a template where the segments are there and then you intuitively start drawing out. I also went to search for images that contain sort of latent animation. All the images you can see here are date from before the invention of the Phenakistoscope. On the left is a piece of a piece of pottery from Persia. I have to look into my notes, from the late 13th or early 14th century. So there's a lot of Middle Eastern pottery which contains a latent animation. It's really fascinating, especially from Persia and from the Iznik pottery from Turkey. You have very interesting results. But also the Romans were very dedicated GIF makers. So on the right, you can see a mosaic, which is from an ancient Roman settlement found near Gaziantep in Turkey. They are both animated GIFs. No, they're not GIFs. They're MP4 files. So this is the fish, and here you have the Roman mosaics twisting around. One of my absolute favorites is the one on the left, which is Cosmati pavement. So the Cosmati family was an Italian family who were specialized in making mosaics. And so this is also 1,000 years old, but it's absolutely fascinating to see how it moves. And it also widened my scope on what a Phenakistoscope actually could be. So it is really fascinating. This thing, you can almost not believe that they didn't make it to be animated. So it's really wonderful to see these things come alive. The image you can see on the right is actually not a real ready-made Phenakistoscope. It's a collaborative project with my 8-year-old daughter. So we gathered some leaves in the garden and then we organized them in a way that you could just take a picture, rotate it in After Effects, and also there you have a latent animation. There. So now, in the Phenakistoscope, there's also an alternative way to organize your frames. So not in a circle, but in a spiral. So the image you see on the left is one of my absolute favorites from the 19th century. It's from Joseph Plateau, and most probably he had help from Jean-Baptiste Madou. Jean-Baptiste Madou was a young painter. He was married to the stepsister of Plateau's mentor, Adolphe Quetelet. Belgium is a very small country. Everyone knows everyone. But Madou was a very talented painter. He later became very famous. If you go to Brussels, there's even a metro station called after him, Metro Station Madou. And these spiraling phenakistoscopes are ideal for making metamorphosis animation. So here you can see very beautiful metamorphosis going from a young woman to an old woman and then into a devil. I've done a couple of these myself, so they're very fun to do, very intuitive to do hand-drawn animations like this. Both of these animations, by the way, were selected for Never Give Up, which is the GIF program on the Fantoche Festival in Switzerland. So the examples we saw before were both hand-drawn, but you can also do them digital. And when you do it digital, then you can add a lot more detail. It's quite technical. I won't go into the details of this one because it requires a lot of scripting and a lot of trial and error with the scripting to get the numbers right. But there's a lot of detail there. So the images are usually 8,000 by 8,000 or 9,000 by 9,000 pixels. So you can zoom into them very closely, and then you'll see a very short fragment here. So because you have so much information, you can pan and zoom with your camera. This one is still unpublished. I'm working with someone on audio for this. This one you might know as the background of the invitation for this talk. So also here, very short. Oops. And then next, this one is maybe we can watch this more or less to its full extent. It's not so long. So here you see so a pan and zoom in After Effects, but it also loops perfectly, so you can make it loop forever. You might have noticed that you have a movement going from the center out and also towards the center. So it's very easy to do if you mirror your image. If you flip your image horizontally, it will either go from the center out or the opposite way. So a next development was the zoetrope. I've never much worked with the classical zoetrope, but of course, as you know, you couldn't be in better hands than with Professor Veras for everything related to the zoetrope. But for me, one of the real founding fathers of cinema and animation is Charles-Émile Renault. He was the inventor of a variation on the zoetrope, which is called the Praxinoscope, and which doesn't use a cylinder or a drum with slits as a shutter, but a prismatic mirror. It's very easy to make a Praxinoscope, so you can very easily laser cut or 3D print a polygonal volume. And then if you use plastic mirrors, am I allowed to do some advertising? I bought mine on Amazon for 12 euros. Which is about $12 for 20 plastic mirrors, and you can easily cut them out with a cutter knife, and then you have your own Praxinoscope. Renault also made some variations on his invention. So one of these is the Toupie Fantoche. So it only holds four images, so 4 frames, but it is totally unmatched in its cuteness, and also very easy to make. If you have like a maker space on your campus, it's very easy to make these yourself. Next is a Praxinoscope combined with a magic lantern. So there, Renault made the step to projecting his images in 1882. And he worked on this invention for a long time. And then he came up with this, the theateroptiek, which is the first time we have like the real cinema experience long before cinema was officially invented. So cinema was officially invented 7 years later, but the invention of Renault already had the same dispositive as cinema. So at the heart was still a Praxinoscope, so a polygonal mirror, but he also used sprocket holes to advance his film, and he even used compositing. So the background was a single image, which was being projected, and then the moving image came on top of that. Unfortunately, so after the invention of cinema, the success of Renault waned very fast. So before he had a huge audience, but after cinema was invented, his theateroptiek was nearly empty. He was so disappointed that he destroyed nearly all his work. So Pauvre Pierrot is one of the very rare films which was preserved from Renault. But for me, it was one of the big inventors of cinema. So it also shows how harsh these times were in getting the audience to watch your films. So later on, he had to work as a clerk to provide himself a living. During the 20th century, then, most of these optical toys were used as just for children, as real toys, but often with very pleasing results, such as the Red Raven records. So the Red Raven records were produced from 1956 to the early 70s, and they integrated audio. So it was a record, it was intended to use with a record player. Then you had a magic mirror based on the Praxinoscope, which provided the animation, which was printed, of course, on the disc itself. So here's a little example I tried myself. Something I'm I'll certainly continue working with. This little film is called Hypnagoria. So you can watch this without a camera. So the magic mirror works as a shutter. But of course, you see, when you film a device like this, you have an interference between the shutter of your camera and the Praxinoscope-based shutter. And that's the next topic we're gonna touch upon, which is the external shutter. So we've already seen that phenakistoscopes existed with an external shutter disc. I've also experimented with making my own shutter discs. So the image you can see on top is is a handheld fan, where I placed instead of the fan itself, I've placed a shutter disc, 3D printed shutter disc, which is quite uncommon. Usually, as an external shutter, a strobe light is being used, which already existed actually in the 19th century. So before strobe lights were officially invented, there were Geisler tubes, and Ottomar Anschutz used a synchronized Geisler tube for his electrotachiscope. Contemporary examples, Gregory Barsemian, he makes the most wonderful installations, which are also animated with a synchronized strobe light. Or Peter Hudson, he makes giant installations at the Burning Man Festival, also with a strobe light. Using a camera shutter as an external shutter is something more recent, because as we have seen, an analog film camera has this 180 degrees shutter, which yields too much motion blur to film a phenakistoscope or zoetrope. So it's something which is really from the digital age. The pioneer there was Eric Dyer, and Jim Lefebvre was the first one to combine this with a record player, and who coined the name phonotrope. Here's another example with the separate shutter disc. So this is again a fan which is more or less hacked, not a handheld or hand cranked fan, but so a little plastic fan which is USB powered. And so I've hacked two of these small fans, and one contains an animation, and then the other one contains the shutter disc. So when you peer through the shutter disc, you can see it as an animation. When you look above it, it becomes one indistinguishable motion blur. Synchronization is the toughest part about using an external shutter. So over here, it's quite late, but in the United States, I think it's time for a bit of a math class. So synchronization means that you have to synchronize both your shutter with the drawings and the rotation speed of the device which is driving your animation. So we have some variables. We have the frequency in rounds per second. There's the radial velocity, omega. There's a frame rate or pulse rate. So frame rate on the camera, pulse rate if you'd use a strobe light. And there's the angle of your disk sector. So the angle of your segment, and then the number of segments you need. So here's the formula that it's sip in for a while, but I'll give you an example which will make it a lot clearer, because this is, I guess, quite hard for most people, also for me. So a synchronization example, suppose you have a 45 RPM record player and a 24p camera. Then your main question is, of course, how many segments, how many drawings do I need? So 45 RPM, rounds per minute, we have to calculate first how many rounds per seconds this will become. So 45 divided by 60 gives us 0.75 rounds per second. Then we have the formula for radial velocity for omega is 2 times p times our rounds per second. So this gives us the number 4.712. And then we can calculate the angle of our disk sector, theta, which is very simple, which is our radial velocity divided by frame rate or the pulses of our stroboscope. So the numbers become a bit longer. We have 4.712 divided by 24 yields us 0.19633. And then the main part of our question is how many images, how many segments or drawings do we need? That is 2 multiplied by pi and then divided by our angle of the disk sector. And this gives us an almost round number of 32.002, which means if you use a 24p camera, or a strobe light with 24 flashes per second, you need 32 segments on a disk. But with this formula, you can calculate every possible rotation speed, camera frame rate, and synchronize everything. But it's really at the heart, the calculation is really at the heart what you need if you want to go and make installations with this technique. So here are a number. I'll maybe show little fragments because we don't have so much time anymore, but some little fragments of phonotropes. So these are hand-drawn very intuitively. And of course, when you go and film these phonotropes, then it's very important to keep your shutter of your camera as short as possible. So the more light you have, the better. So that will give you much more temporal sharpness. So this one is called bounce. And so hand-drawn animation. And this one is just called 45 RPM. It's an abstract animation. So over to the next step, and that is 3D Zortropes. The man you see with the gun is Etienne Jules Marais. He's not holding a gun to kill. On the contrary, Etienne Jules Marais was one of the pioneers of chronophotography along with Edward Muybridge. And he used his chronophotographic gun to study the motion of birds, especially. So he made little plaster casts of the bird in flight and converted that into, as far as I know, but maybe Dr. Veras can tell me otherwise if I'm mistaken, but as far as I know, this is the oldest example of a 3D zoetrope
You are
from.
absolutely correct. Yes.
Yeah,
At
thank
least
you.
the oldest one that we know of. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Um, and this brings me to my work with 3D printed zoetropes. So 3D printed zoetropes, I've called them N dash tropes, N tropes. I don't have a better name because if you externalize your shutter, if you take away the drum, the cylinder with the slits, then it becomes actually a combination between a zoetrope and a phenakistoscope. So if you look at it from a top view, then you get a phenakistoscope. If you look from a side view, you get a zoetrope. But of course, you can choose any angle, and that's the beauty about it. So here's a small example. So if anyone has a better suggestion for an N trope, it's always more than welcome. So this is conceptualized as a small film, but in the main part, of course, it's a loop. And so the way you as a viewer relate to an object like this is different than from a normal cinematic experience. So in cinema, there are next to no loops. Why not? Because you sit down and you're watching a movie. It would be intolerable for an audience to watch something like this for 1.5 hours. Where do you find loops? You find them in an art gallery, you find them in a museum, you find them where the moving image is in public space. So where do you find them? You find them where the audience is moving, not where the audience is sitting still. You also find them, of course, on the internet, on social media, and in a way, the audience is also moving. So when you're scrolling on your screen, is also a metaphorical. You are sitting in your chair, but metaphorically, you are moving with your thumb to your screen, and that is where loops are at home. Um, so when you're working with these N tropes, I know it's a bit of an uninspired term, but the magical part about this is you don't see any animation, of course. If you look at this with the naked eye, you only see animation when you use an external shutter. So this one is filmed with a camera, but of course you can also leave this to the audience because everyone carries an external shutter around, which is your smartphone. So it's a bit like AR, but then much more simple and actually almost the reserved principle. So you see things on your smartphone, which your smartphone can see, but by itself, but what you cannot see with the naked eye. So it's a bit of magic if you can discover the animation which is there, which you cannot see without an external shutter. So for making these things, if you're interested in this, I can go deeper into this next week. I work with Cinema 4D, which is a very intuitive 3D program. So if you want to use it as a student, it's for free. You can find it on the website. It's by Maxon. I think it's not completely for free, but you pay like $3 administration costs for, I think, 6 months. So what is interesting about Cinema 4D is that you have Radial Cloner, which allows you to put all the elements in a circle very easily. And there's also a voxel-based volume builder, volume mesher, which allows you to easily make animations and also to make them into one single object, which you can then 3D print without too much hassle. Rotation, if you do it internally, animate it internally in Cinema 4D, rotation is the same as in After Effects. Only watch out because Cinema 4D uses auto easing on its keyframes, so you have to make your keyframes linear. So here's a little example I made. So this is a digital example made in Cinema 4D with Arnold's renderer, then rendered out as a GIF loop. But the nice thing about 3D printing is, of course, that you go back to an analog format. So at the campus, we have a resin printer, a Formlabs printer, really expensive machine, which is also used for medical appliances. Which yields very highly detailed and clean prints. But to make some prototypes, I bought a very cheap Ender printer, which is sitting at my basement. And this prints with PLA with very, very cheap material. And at first I was a bit disappointed because the images were so noisy. But then when you see it spinning around, the noise brings your models also very much alive. So in the settings of the Cura software, which you use for slicing up your 3D models for printing, I went to change the settings deliberately to introduce more noise in the refraction. So it's a bit of unintended use, but which gives me a nice result. And it's also fun to consider post-production as something you do with sandpaper, a heat gun, paint, glue, and dust. Something very different than working with DaVinci Resolve and After Effects for post-production purposes. So my favorite tools then are an old Canon camera. I have a very better, newer one, but on the older cameras you can install Magic Lantern firmware, which allows you to record in any possible frame rate. And I also like to use older lenses. My favorite one here is the one you see attached with a bit of gaffer's tape. So it's a 1978 lens from Tamron, which is a macro lens, and it gives you a very soft and more analog look. So here's I'll show maybe a very short fragment of this one. So this one is done with the resin printer. And then another very intriguing field of research is integrating audio. So this is maybe just a first step where I've tried to 3D print a locked groove because I use a record player. I try to integrate a locked groove audio track. It didn't work out really well. So the sound you hear is a combination of the intended noise of what it actually gave on the record player, and then because I filmed it outside, there was the rooster of our neighbors. It was very distressed, and you can hear him too. So short fragments, and then so it's these wormholes in media history that makes media archaeology so intriguing. There's a lot more examples, but our time is of course limited. So I wanted to conclude with another inspirational quote from Siegfried Zielinski. Many art and design activists choose to create something originally by establishing unusual connections between existing means of expression and or material. Such work stands out significantly from the media products we encounter every day. So as a conclusion, look at media and technological evolutions with one eye oriented to the past and the other one oriented towards the future, which is of course a reference also to an animation film from Theodor Ushev, Blind and Vaisha. Also experiment even when you don't see an immediate goal or results. So it's often by experimenting, by doing things rather aimlessly, that you come up with the best ideas. And if it doesn't immediately give a result, then it's always your room of treasures for the future. Always be very confident in the process. Don't give up too easily. So keep on trying, and eventually you'll get there. And always keep an eye open for happy accidents. So the quote from Bob Ross. So the last thing we're going to see is status continuum, and it's actually also a happy accident. It's a misprint, 3D misprint. I had exported the wrong file, and it came out way too small. But then I tried to look for a solution to film it, and that gave it its unique atmosphere. So embrace all your happy accidents. So I have a very small fragment of this one too, because I see our time is nearly up. So it took me a little bit longer, my talk, than I guessed it would. I see we have 2 more minutes left for a Q&A, but of course we also have next week.
Yes, yes. So thank you. Thank you, Professor Devadder. Um, And we could have time for one question if anyone, because we have next week as well. So based on the presentation, the students can come back and ask more detailed questions. But I was curious if anyone would like to comment or ask anything.
Or if you have requests for next week, that would also be
That's
very
a good
most
point.
welcome.
Yeah, something that you would like to hear
And
more about it.
if anyone, for instance, wants to know more about how to work with Cinema 4D, how to work with 3D
Mm-hmm.
printing.
I see Elmira's hand is up. Go ahead, Elmira.
Yes, thank you very much for your amazing presentation and amazing work.
Thank you very
Uh,
much.
I have a question about the work that you showed in the beginning. It was a combination of celluloids in a sequence, like transparent celluloid. So I wanted to see if there is any video of that instrument that we can watch somewhere.
Yes, I put the link on the chat. That's Animation Direct on film.
Oh,
Yeah.
great. Thank you.
So there was also, because I also used the same technique for drawing. So for drawing or comics, graphic storytelling. So I also use plastic film, acetate film to draw on. So one was an that you can find on Vimeo. The other one is sort of a comic book. I don't suppose you could call it a comic book because it's very experimental, but it's only in Dutch. But if you want, I can give you a link.
Yeah, thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Yeah. So I suppose Dr. Veras can give me your email, and then I'll send you a link on Google Drive, and then you can
Sure.
access it. Yeah.
And so for next week, when we have the talk and we work with the students, do we have any specific requests or things that you're interested? I think Martin, Gerardo, Hayden, Nicholas, Scott, Emily, Ali, you will all be there. Does anything that sparked your curiosity from today that we can explore a little bit more next week? Okay, they are all in silence, in awe.
Yeah.
Hi,
Yes,
sorry, can you
Hayden.
hear me? Hi,
Yes.
okay. Hi, your presentation was
Hi.
really cool. First of all the different artworks you showed were really interesting. But
Thank you.
I'm working on a zoetrope right now and having some
Mhm.
problems getting it to read correctly. So, just maybe we could talk more about like designing the action within them to like better fit the medium of it being a zoetrope.
Okay. Yeah. 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 If you could prepare maybe then for next week some images that always helps
Yeah,
to see how I
he
can help
does
you.
have. He
Ah, yeah.
does have, and then this whole idea of being from digital to transpose to the device itself, right? Which
Hmm.
can be tricky. Sometimes what you see in the digital test is not necessarily what you are going to
Ah,
experience in the
yeah. Yeah.
device. So there's always that conflict. Yeah, so
Yeah.
that's
Yeah.
it. Yeah, and we also, I think we have Marcelo. He's not here today, but he's also working on the Praxinoscopes.
Ah, yeah.
Okay. So
Okay.
just before everybody goes, I just want to share that we'll have another event, which is Animated Perspectives on Violence Against Women, which is next Tuesday at 1, from 1 to, no, sorry, 4 p.m. And you probably have seen all my announcements about that as well. And for now, thank you so much, Professor Devadder, and for sharing with us your expertise and your work, your beautiful work. And we're looking forward to the discussion and critique with the students next week. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you all for attending. I'm very curious to see all your work next week. So thanks for having me, and see you next week then. And thank you also, Dr. Veras, for organizing this event.